The future of film and TV production is in Ontario. We've expanded our studio space. We've built virtual production sets, Canada's largest backlot, and an unparalleled workforce. Our Ontario Green Screen program ensures a more sustainable industry. We are Ontario, and we're ready to roll.
For 6 exciting years, we've shared stories connecting us to each other and our region. Celebrating our internationally recognized storytellers, encouraging diverse and emerging voices, and bringing you the best our region has to offer. This October, join us however you choose, online from home or in person in downtown London. The Forest City Film Festival invites you to see what's on.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second in our Behind the Scenes series of talks, sponsored by CIBC Wood Gundy, Burnett Oransky, and Dale Private Wealth Management. My name is Dorothy Downs, and it is my pleasure to introduce our host today, who will go behind the scenes with one of Canada's most successful screenwriters. Before we invite our host onto the stage, I would like to thank Film London for their support of Ontario Screen Creators Conference, which is what this event is a part of, actually. So at this point, I want to acknowledge that this land has been home to storytellers for thousands of years. And so as a film festival that celebrates the stories of our regional storytellers, it's our pleasure and our responsibility to acknowledge that the land that we are located on is part of the treaty lands of the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe of the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Lenape of the Munsee Delaware Nation, and it's also the traditional territory of the Oneida Nation of the Thames, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is a covenant between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and protect the land and resources. We are grateful to live and work in this beautiful place. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our host for this behind the scenes talk with Emma Donoghue. Please welcome Kate Dubinski from the CBC.
Thank you, Dorothy. Hello, good afternoon. So it is my pleasure to welcome Emma Donoghue, who you all know about, but I will tell you a little bit more about her just in case. So she is a playwright, a novelist, and a screenwriter. Her 2010 novel Room was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize and, of course, was turned into an Oscar-winning film, with Emma herself winning the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Not a bad first shot at screenwriting. Emma was born in Dublin, and she is the youngest of 8 children. She now has 2 kids of her own, and she lives with her partner and the kids in Wortley Village. The Wonder was published in 2016 and was shortlisted for the Giller. It takes place in 1850s Ireland. The screenplay is written by Emma and playwright Alice Birch, and the film will be directed, or has been directed, by Sebastián. Lelio. It will be hitting Netflix in 2022. Last year, Pull of the Stars was published. It's her 13th novel, and we're going to talk all about adaptation and The Wonder. So please welcome Emma.
Well, as a first in-person event, I couldn't choose anything nicer than London, Ontario, and the Wolf performance space, could I? So this is wonderful. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. I think it's the first time we've been in person it's the first time I've been in person in 2 years. So
yeah.
So tell me about, we were just talking backstage about where exactly The Wonder is in in the screen process.
We have wrapped, as they say. It is being edited now, and Netflix will bring it out in some form next year. I say in some form because it's funny how even a few years ago we would have thought of Netflix as, like, by contrast with cinema, you have Netflix. And now, of course, they're all doing each other's things. And so, we're hoping there might be film festivals or a cinema release given the caliber of talent. We've got, say, Florence Pugh is our lead Sebastián Lelio, who won Best Foreign Oscar for A Fantastic Woman. So, you know, it's going to be a fantastic film, this one. So I really hope it'll be in cinemas. But either way, I know it'll end up on Netflix next year. So.
And how involved were you?
Very involved. It's not that I'm a control freak, can I just say. It's more I'm a highly enthusiastic participant in these various arts. And I also really enjoy the moving between these arts. I enjoy the process of adaptation. I think it's really interesting what happens to a story when you tell it in film or theatre as opposed to in fiction. No one is better than the others. They all have their strengths. And I love the way it changes rather than always wanting to keep it the same. So yes, in this case, just like with Room, I was very involved. It's kind of unusual what I do at the contractual level, because years ago when I first got a screen agent, she said to me, do you want, money up front, whether the film gets made or not, or do you want as much involvement as possible? And I said, involvement.
So it's either or.
Well, in that you get paid in the end anyway, but it's a question of when. So I do these unusual attachment deals where I don't get paid until the first day of filming. So obviously there's a risk, many of my projects have not made it to the screen, so then you don't get paid. But the advantage is that you don't sell your rights outright and then have the film get sort of lost in the wilderness, never made, or made badly. Right. I've met many authors who flinch when you talk about the film of their books, or they'll claim not to have seen it because they clearly can't bear to speak about it. So this way I stay very involved. I worked with very trusted people. I worked with Element Pictures, who made Room. So I knew, they showed such passionate commitment, but also good taste in making Room, that I knew that the wonder would be safe with them too. And again, it's a child-centered project that, you wouldn't want it to go in any tacky direction, just like with Room. So in this case, different director and different funders, but it's still basically me and Element, who are a small Irish company, sort of safeguarding this very Irish story in this case. Yeah, and they always said they would film it in Ireland, for instance. So yeah, it's been a big thrill. So actually being there in August, my first time on an airplane, my first time out of London, Ontario since pandemic began, you can't imagine my excitement. Even though being on a film set these days is very strange, everyone's thickly masked all the time except for the actors. And you have to have tests twice a week, for instance, COVID tests, and there are all sorts of protocols about who's in which pod and which things you can touch or not.
Is that right?
It was still fun. Yeah. Much more eating outside rather than being in a sort of, a giant dining van, for instance. You'd all be standing around outside eating off compostable plastic plates.
I was going to say, because, I picture films, tiny trailers where everyone's sort of gathered and eating or doing things in between. But.
No, there was, they've trailers for the stars, but mostly you're getting extremely good food from vans and standing outside. But luckily the Irish climate is not hard to do that in. I was just saying that Irish filmmaking can happen all year round, obviously, in that it can rain any time of year. It's not a seasonal matter.
And so you just told me right before we went on that you got to be an extra
in the
film. So tell me about that.
Well, I didn't dare ask, right? In that, with all these COVID protocols, I thought it's not a good time to ask any favors and to be a nuisance, so I didn't ask. But we had a very chatty Californian publicist who Netflix had embedded with us. It's like a military campaign. I was told, we have an embedded publicist and photographer. Like there all the time. So he said to me, have you ever been an extra? And I was like, it's my dearest wish, So he managed to get me to suggest it to Sebastián, our director, who Sebastián and I have worked so closely on this project. So he and Alice Birch, who's a playwright and screenwriter, and we are the 3 screenwriters on this. And Sebastián is the director as well. So it's been a real meeting of minds. And anyway, Sebastián wrote to me and said, you could be an extra in a scene where a group of parishioners are talking to the priest after Mass, and then Florence Pugh marches up and drags him off to talk to her. And our job was to look a bit scandalized. So this involved a 12-piece outfit. I've never been in such hip pain in my life. The corset, I was winched together like in instrument of torture. And it made me realize that every time I write a film set in the past, you know, all the women actors are going to be spending the summer in extreme discomfort.
There's your feminism. You have to.
I know, exactly. And Florence Pugh said to me, you can either eat or breathe, but not both. So breathe now and eat afterwards.
Wow.
And she also suggested, she said, keep a few mint humbugs up your sleeve, which sounded so Mary Poppins somehow. You know, I think many aspects of their costumes were uncomfortable because they're so realistic.
Right.
So Florence said, for instance, that the little wooden heels on the shoes, you know, she'd be standing around all day doing takes, and I'd notice every few takes she'd suddenly like do a deep squat just to try and relieve the muscles, you know. So yeah, I was in this 12-piece outfit, and I found for the first 2 takes I wildly overacted because I had so little to do, and I'd been an extra once at, I think, 14, but not since. So, you know, the first couple of times when Florence marches towards us, I'm there like, more or less, see, you won. And then I said to myself, Emma, you're an extra. You're meant to be invisible. And above all, if you're an extra and you're the writer, you're meant to be invisible, not, you know, hamming it up. But also, you know, this is the mid-19th century and you're wearing 12 layers, so you know you should be quite restrained in your gestures. You know, I'm not a modern person. I'm playing a Victorian person. So then I reined it in so much that I've actually seen the footage and I barely react. I'm standing there with my bonnet and a big bow, and then Florence Pugh marches up, drags the priest off, and I glance her way once, and then I lean towards one of my peers and rhubarb with them. But no actual acting happened. But I still think that's better than if I'd hammed it up.
Yeah,
you know.
that's hilarious. That sounds fun.
Great. It was a fascinating experience. And I got to talk to all the other extras, and you realize films are just, you know, every film draws on an army of extras, you know. And they're such veterans of the business. They've been in so many. Yeah. My favorite was a man who said to me that he was human sacrificed on Vikings, which is a huge production they've going on in Dublin. And he said, and they brought me back the next season.
So that's one of the differences between working on Room and working on this film, that you share the writing credits, the screenplay credits, right? So Room, you said you wrote the book, and then you were waiting for the novel to come out, so you were like, I've got nothing else to do, might as well turn it into a screenplay.
It was more with Room. I thought if I waited till the book was out, that then I might be nudged out of a screenwriting position, because I was so aware that, you know, most films are written by full-time professional screenwriters. It's a very sort of specialist trade. Yeah. And I wanted to have a go at it first. So yeah, I thought I would try it before the book actually came out. But, you know, on that question of sharing credit, it's interesting. I think almost no film is really 100% written by one person. Because lines happen on screen in many ways. For instance, Jake Tremblay and Brie Larson improvised many of their lines. Or they ad-libbed them. In the case of Jake, he wasn't even reading much then. So Lenny Abrahamson, our director, he was often lying down in the bath in the room so that you couldn't see him. And sometimes he was under the floorboard speaking through a hole. And he'd be saying to Jake, like, okay, Jake, remember you're going to chat to her about what you're having for dinner and how you feel about the vegetables. You know, so he'd give him the gist of it. And then Jake would improvise. Other lines might have been the actor's suggestion beforehand. Other lines might have been Lenny's suggestion. So films accrete layers. Lenny could easily have asked for a screenwriting credit on that. So it's quite common for directors to really have a huge hand in shaping the script, whether editorially or by suggesting lines. So in this case, Sebastián just formalized that by saying he wanted to be a co-writer on it. But I think there's almost always a kind of a collaboration. And when you write a screenplay, you can't think of it as like a novel where you pick every word. So much is going to change between the shooting script and the finished product anyway. You might think, oh, I've controlled the script, and then, you know, the editing, so much will get rearranged or thrown away. And that's all.
Or it sounds more natural for that actor to say it in a different way.
Exactly, and that's all part of the art of it, you know. And one of our actors who was playing the maid, she had a scene in The Wonder where she's to open the door and greet them, and then sort of steps back and they step in. And she said, I think she would say in Irish, you know, come on in. And luckily she had enough Irish that she could just improvise that. But I mean, that kind of thing is just the actors using their wits to make it more clear on the day. Or they might have some time to fill because an action is taking longer than you thought. So again, it'll seem natural to fill in a line there. So yeah, it's a very organic process with so many people contributing. It's so unlike fiction where,
Right.
you know, like I'd get to be boss.
That's right, yeah. Now, were there things that you said, this absolutely has to be in the movie? Or this, or I guess I could live without this?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I'm sure, I don't remember any big arguments about sort of plot. I mean, sometimes I'd be fussier about things being true to the period than Sebastián. Sebastián doesn't want it to be like a conventional period drama at all. So he would often be arguing for it to be more different from the past. And I would often be like the kind of, you know, the geek saying, I don't think they had that in 1859, you know. But I don't remember any big debates about it, no. Okay. I think we both always wanted it to be a thrilling film. And we're both aware that there's so many period dramas that just seem like every other one, you know, that just seem so conventional. So whatever you can do to kind of shake up the audience and make them sort of see it happening afresh rather than just thinking corsets is a good thing. Florence Pugh made one brilliant contribution on day one. The character in the book, Nurse Libright, she's an educated English woman. She's not particularly posh, but she's, you know, educated and scientifically trained. So she turns up in Ireland and she seems very haughty to the locals. And Florence Pugh said, can I do her in a Yorkshire accent? We were like, okay. And she'd been doing reading about the nurses who were trained by Florence Nightingale. She said a lot of them came from Yorkshire. So we were like, fine. Yeah. And as soon as I saw the first bit of footage, because they sent me a link to the dailies or the rushes every evening. It was thrilling. I was getting daily installments. I realized that the Yorkshire accent was completely safeguarding the character from coming across as too judgy or posh or, you know, Downton Abbey-esque. Yeah, yeah. So that was a brilliant initiative on her part to really emphasize the earthy and the practical and the warm in that character rather than the, you know, the snooty.
Right, yeah,
So yeah, that's the kind of thing. It's not in the script, but it makes all the difference. Yeah. You know?
Did you have a hand in casting?
Well, I was certainly in on those debates. One of the advantage of not selling the rights outright until just before the film happens is that I'm sort of guaranteed to be part of those discussions. In that so many writers will tell you that they, you know, sold the rights to Hollywood, and then the writer often feels appalled and outraged and left out of discussions. But sometimes it's because they've, you know, sold them outright. Right. So yeah, I was always part of those discussions, but, you know, never tried to be the one with the deciding vote, because I really see a good film as the director's film. Yeah. So anyway, I was thrilled to get Florence. I had thought we'd be casting older than her. She's only 25, but she's got that down-to-earth, solid feel. She's got a very low voice because of, strangely enough, childhood illness. She had a sort of collapsed windpipe in her childhood. So she's ended up with this really husky voice and this low laugh. Like all around the set, you'd hear this distinctively low laugh, and you'd be, here she is again. She was in every single scene. Right. You know, she never got a break. She had her dog with her in her trailer, and she would go off and have like really brief play sessions, briefly put him on Instagram. You know, he has a huge following.
That's funny. So Lib in the book is about 25, right?
You know, I don't specify, but she's sort of not young, so probably, of course, in the Victorian times,
but yeah, I was going to say,
not young at 25. But let's just say, I suppose I didn't want anyone kind of girlish, but in fact, Florence Pugh is acting it with such a kind of, you know, solidity and toughness that she doesn't come across as too young at all.
That's very neat,
So we were thrilled to get her. And, you know, the various men of the village are a sort of panoply of classic Irish acting talent, you know. I was particularly thrilled for our priest. We had Ciarán Hinds, who he played Julius Caesar in HBO's Rome, and he has this amazing hard face. Yeah.
It must have been, it's interesting because you're from Ireland and you're filming this film about Ireland. It sounds like you're living in a world that you created, in the world that you came from.
And we were making it in the landscapes of my childhood, in that I grew up in the Dublin suburbs, but every Sunday we went on drives into County Wicklow and across this particular very bare, it's called the Old Military Road, across the bogs. And it's a really bleak and bleakly beautiful landscape. And where the novel is set in the middle of Ireland, in the flat bogs there, we wanted bogland that was a bit more kind of scenically dramatic. So we went for the bogs of Wicklow. So it looks a bit like an Irish Western in the footage I've seen so far. You know, there's a lovely scene where the journalist is on a horse sort of clip-clopping along this tiny little path across the hills. And it's beautiful. And they were so careful of the environment. Like the area where they built the outside of the girl's house, they had to put down a membrane so that nothing of the set or of the greens brought in to dress the set would touch the actual bog. We weren't allowed to cut any bog. We had to just buy some chunks of turf from a man who had ancestral bog cutting rights. We had to be so careful of it. Again, they made this little graveyard for a couple of scenes, and when I went back with my sister the next week, there was no sign of it. They'd cleared it all away again. My sister helps to run a big mountaineering organization in Ireland, and she said they'd been getting furious phone calls saying, somebody has built a 2-story house in the precious boglands. And she was able to tell them it was all just the magic of film.
That's so great.
Yeah.
That part, I have not been to that part of, I've not been to Ireland, but it's certainly a character in the book, right? And as I was reading it, I thought of that, a long lens and then someone clipping across or whatever.
And you want the beauty, but you don't want it to be pretty or saccharine.
Right.
You know, there've been a lot of bad films set in Ireland with haunting bagpipe or fiddle music and pretty maidens.
Right.
So this one, you know, Florence is always muddy to mid-shin.
Yeah.
We've got a scene where she's, you know, I'd written it, you know, with a stroke of a laptop. You know, she pushes through a flock of sheep, I wrote. And then we spent the entire morning with these sheep who were clearly terrified of the sheepdog. And at one point, very much in character, Florence gave one of the sheep a big smack on the butt to get it out of the way, and it knocked her over. And we all just, I was thinking, we'll have broken the knees of our Hollywood star, all because I wrote in the flock of sheep. But luckily, we had covered the road of that village with, I'm saying we, as if I picked up any bag of turf. There was a thick layer of bark chippings covering the road every time we wanted to film on the road itself. So Florence said she'd come to no harm, and the only problem was her dress was wet, and this meant a 15-minute wait, you know, and every minute on film was costing so much. We all waited, and we could hear the hairdryers. They were desperately trying to dry the dress. Yeah,
that's funny.
But yes, it's very earthily filmed. Her breathing, even, you can hear a lot of like her breathing heavily as she marches across the hills. And one wonderful thing about her performance is that it's so earthy. You see her eating a lot and moving a lot and being very strong. And the film really is all about a little girl claiming to live without food. You know, femininity as a kind of refusal of the body and being all ethereal. And Florence is kind of a living advertisement for the physical. Right. You know, she's completely in her body. We've got lots of scenes of her eating, for instance. So it's as if just in herself, quite apart from anything she says, she's teaching this girl, you know, live with your complete body. None of your body's needs are shameful.
Right. Well, it would have been bad if what you could eat on set was what they ate in the book, because it wasn't all very appealing, was it?
It's funny, there's so many things on the call sheet that aren't actual filming. So one day I noticed that they wrote down, you know, a booked session to show Florence all the available foods that she would be eating on set and, on film, and to have her try them out, because they're all gray. They put black food coloring in them all to give them that 19th century Irish, you know, dusky pallor. Yeah. Wow. So, and they were mostly made of potato or of things other than they were, and she was to try them out. She's a very enthusiastic foodie, in fact, and she said they all tasted delicious, and she asked to take them all home with her to keep for the next day. But the next day she did come in and report that when she'd opened her fridge, they were all grey. She had to say to herself, it does taste good, it just doesn't look like it tastes good.
It just doesn't look like it.
Yeah.
It's like my Polish Christmas dinner we have. There's not a lot of color, but it's all delicious.
But she was just so enthusiastic about every aspect of it, even the grey food, you know. Yeah. And I think when your star is so, all in and enthusiastic, it really sets the tone, because then nobody gripes about, something taking longer or doing a scene again a million times. You know, she just set a really, really cheerful tone. Yeah.
What about Anna?
Oh, we have this amazing 11-year-old for Anna. We were quite worried at first because we couldn't find an Anna in Ireland, and I really wanted one with a convincing Irish accent, you know. And they said we're going to have to look outside Ireland, and I was thinking, oh no, you know. But they found an English daughter of an Irish actress who can do her mother's accent perfectly, and her mother is a brilliant Irish actress as well, and we hired the pair of them to play mother and daughter.
Oh,
so
nice.
it couldn't be better because it
wow,
meant,
I didn't realize
so Keela, hang on, Lord Cassidy and Elaine Cassidy, who's been in film since she was 18, they play mother and daughter, and it was lovely because the daughter had so many scenes to play with her mother, and you'd hear them kind of chatting and joking and so on. I remember one scene, they were sitting there on the bed in the kind of dark cabin, and they were, you know, joking a bit about religion and saying something about, Keela said something about, that time I went to Mass, it just seemed silly to me. And just then, a St. Bridget's cross fell off the wall of our set and onto the floor. We were all like, whoa.
It must have been hard to, if you've seen the shots, like, to show this kid kind of wasting away. Well, because you're obviously feeding the kid, the actual actress.
But also even in the book, the girl is not, you know, skeletally thin. I really read up a lot on the kind of physiology of starving, and there are several ways it can take you, and in some ways, in some forms, if you're very slowly deprived of food, you can really have quite swollen belly, quite swollen ankles and so on. And Irish, you know, clothing, it's very, you know, 19th century Irish clothing, it's all very prudish and body hiding anyway. Yeah. So it was never about making her look, say, like we might imagine anorexia looks today. It's mostly about the power of her acting. She's just so intense and believable in how she acts that's what you focus on rather than the body. But I think they have some, you know, cunning tricks as well, but it's mostly about believing in the acting.
Yeah. Was it, like that chemistry must have been great between the mum and the daughter then? If they're
excellent, yeah. And the mother in the film and in the book is quite sinister, but, you know, I can report that mother and daughter as actors seem to be just having a blast together. Yeah.
And you, so when the first time I ever met Emma was when, right before Room came out, or the week Room came out, the book, and it was at the London Public Library, and you talked about getting your son in a carpet, which is one of the scenes in Room, and showing how he might escape and rewriting that scene. Did you so you have a daughter who's about that age when you were writing The Wonder?
Well, I obviously wasn't going to ask her to do without any meals, but I used to look across the table at her, like eating her pasta, and I would think, okay, what if you were a bright, able, healthy girl, but in a culture which emphasized doing it without giving up, purity, you know, how might the talents and energies of a girl like that get funneled into not just Catholicism, but a really extreme, very anti-body form of Catholicism. Because we're all shaped by our culture, and, you know, luckily our kids' culture nowadays is saying, eat your pasta, enjoy it, you know. But Una picked the riddles for me. I wanted the nurse and the child to have a kind of exchange about riddles, so I got Una to read through a box of riddles we had and choose ones that she thought an 11-year-old could guess.
Nice.
You know?
Oh, that's so interesting.
And a couple of those have ended up in the screenplay. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I should mention that I can take questions from the audience for Emma. So let me know if you have any. Thank you for turning up the lights. That was just a warning, just to think about questions. I was supposed to say it at the beginning and I forgot. So think of questions, and I'll maybe ask you one or two more questions, and then we'll see if there are any from the audience. I'm interested in whether or not it was different working with Netflix as opposed to working with not Netflix on Room.
Well, actually, in both cases, I would say I've really worked with relatively small companies. So in the case of Room, it was basically Element Pictures from Ireland. And then we got funding through, say, our distributors like A24. They kind of bought into it in advance, but they stayed very hands-off. So I was really working just with Element. And in the case of The Wonder, I've really just been working with Element and with a small British company called House Productions. And then Netflix have just funded it. So I think something that Netflix are getting known for is their ability to fund creators without trying to micromanage it. So it's not the usual studio model of like, once the studio is involved, they interfere with everything. You know, I asked, for instance, you know, during the shoot, how are Netflix involved? And what I was told was like, they call up once a week and say, do you need more money? You know, what do you need? How can we help?
Say yes, yes.
How can we resource you? Yeah.
Right.
So it's a very interesting model. I think they know that if they try and manage everything, they'll create a homogenous product, and it's not what they want. They want, you know, the brilliant one-offs like, say, Squid Game to come to them from different parts of the world, and then in a way Netflix tries to then get it to everyone rather than, you know, making everything themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say, you know, I've only made films in the kind of more indie mode of relatively small companies and the more sort of European model. I haven't done a big studio film, and anytime I have been approached to, I find myself thinking, I'm unlikely to enjoy this experience. Because interestingly, during the sort of the campaign, they call it, like it's a military campaign, you know, when we were on the awards circuit, I met lots of other screenwriters, and I was dumbstruck by something one of them said to me. She said, were you allowed to contact your director, like, directly? I was thinking, in what world are you writing a film and you're not even allowed to talk directly to the director, you know? And that seems a model of creativity destined to create communication problems and blockages, you know? So in each case, I've made these films with a very small, tight circle of people who are all focused on the art, with the money just being like, you know, what we need to do to pay for the production, but it's never been about the money.
Right.
You know?
For sure. Did you, and how did you and Sebastián come to meet? Like, how did that happen?
Ed Guiney, our producer on both these films, he had made a lovely film with Sebastián set in the sort of Orthodox Jewish London called Disobedience with Rachel Weisz, so he knew him from that. Yeah, so again, you know, it's like I had a trusted relationship with Ed, Ed had a trusted relationship with Sebastián, so it's kind of a link of trust, as it were.
Well, it's all, I imagine it's all, so you have to trust people with, you're trusting them with something that lives in you, right?
Yeah. And as either the screenwriter or the writer of the novel, you do not get to control it all. So it's really a matter of, you know, backing the right horse, like deciding to work with people who, you know, may end up doing things differently from how you would, but you basically think that they are brilliant, and so it's likely to end up well.
Right, yeah. So does anyone have any, okay, I will, what I'm gonna do is I'll get you to ask your question, and then I will repeat it, because we're being filmed. So, yes, the person right there.
So, if it is on Netflix, that means television?
If it's on Netflix, does that mean television?
Yeah, it does. Not necessarily only, no. Netflix now bring out some films in cinemas as well. Some films like, say, Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, they really backed at film festivals and so on, and with a cinema release. In the last 10 years, I would say the lines between, you know, say distributors and producers and TV and streaming and studios, it's all a complete soup, it seems to me. They're all you know, stepping into those different areas. But yes, I would certainly say it'll end up on the Netflix streaming service, but Netflix also bring out films in other ways. Yeah.
Do you think we're seeing we are seeing a shift in how, like you said, it's the soup of where, you know, you wouldn't have ever had a film nominated for an Oscar that didn't come out in a big production in the theaters. But do you think, what do you think of the way that we're now watching films and watching?
It's funny, as a sort of funding model, I think it's great that, for instance, with Room, we didn't have to sell it to a studio. We just had a distributor, A24, who were so enthusiastic that they invested in it at the script stage. So I think that kind of flexibility is great. And say A24 now make their own films as well. It worries me the actual screen size and screen experience, in that I think, you know, really artistic directors make their films to be seen on a big screen. So when you watch it on a smaller screen, it is a diminished experience. And if you watch it on, say, a phone, I think it really must be a diminished experience. And I know myself, I'm sent links to all the Oscar, qualified films, to vote for them. And so I industriously watch a lot of films every autumn. And if it's on my laptop, I just have a tendency to check my email, in a way that if I was sitting down in the cinema, I know I would stay absolutely committed to the film. Yeah. So I worry a bit about the division of our attention and the size of the screen. Yeah. And I noticed post-COVID, I'm feeling very grateful that cinemas still exist, and I'm making a policy now of going to films in the cinema rather than just waiting for them on TV. Yeah.
There was another, the gentleman in the back. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm Luke. I was just wondering what strategies did you use to get your work better seen, and what would you recommend for a competition screenwriter to get their work produced into larger production companies' hands?
So Luke wants to know how you, Emma, got your work seen and read, and for a filmmaker. Sorry, can you repeat that?
The second question was, what would you recommend for a competition screenwriter to get their work produced into larger production companies' hands?
What would you recommend for a competition screenwriter to get their work produced in a larger scale?
I feel I don't have much helpful information on this because I've come into this through being a novelist. So in a way, each of my 2 films that have been made so far have been made because they succeeded as novels first. Like I once, 20 years ago, wrote a spec script and showed it to one producer who was like, it's talented but not quite good enough, and it didn't go any farther than that. So I've never had any success just sending out a screenplay, and yet, it does happen. So I'm not going to pretend to have that information. Sorry. And it seems a bit indirect to say, write a novel and it might be turned into a film, So I don't know. I just know that there are things to apply for, and plenty of good films happen without having in any way gone via something else like a novel. It's just that my experience has been a very peculiar one. And by the way, I have lots of film and TV projects that haven't been made. I have occasionally been approached by a company to adapt somebody else's book. I've done that a couple of times. Hasn't been made yet. I've been approached by a company to write an original TV series, wrote the pilot, hasn't been made yet. Like most writers, I have a raft of projects that are somewhere between development and development hell. I never know at what point you call it development hell, because the first year it feels all like, oh, little seedlings in my garden, and then when you think you haven't heard back from people in several years, at that point you're like, okay, it's probably in development hell. But that is the norm, not getting things made is the norm. No, I'm not going to pretend to have any useful advice.
That's good. That's sometimes the I don't know is the right answer. Yes.
So without getting too much into the weeds, I thought it was really interesting that, and you're a very savvy author, that not including the giving up the full rights until you know it's going into production or closer. I wasn't that familiar with that. So could you explain that more, how you came to that position of not giving up those rights?
So Emma, can you just explain how you came up with this idea or this thing that you do, that you don't give up the rights until a film is made?
Yeah, this is very unusual. It was entirely my screen agent's suggestion, in that she basically said she tries to get each of her authors what it is they're really looking for. So what some of them want is, a yacht as fast as possible. And what others want is to keep their hands on their book and protect it. And I was more the second kind. I think film contracts, even though they have their conventions, they can still include whatever it is you want them to include, especially if you have something they want, like a novel. So for instance, one example springing to mind is, I believe the film contracts for the Twilight films, I believe because of the author's religion, she made them specify things that they would not include. So you can specify anything. In recent years, we've heard about things like inclusivity riders. If you want the film to only be made on Mondays and Tuesdays, you could try specifying that. So what I chose on my agent's advice to specify was, that I would keep control. control's the wrong word, involvement for as long as possible, and that I would get to be an executive producer on it, and that I'd be sort of part of this little circle. And it meant, of course, you know, the advantage was the film company didn't have to pay me until quite late on in the process. Whereas if you are demanding money up front, then they have to go and find money really early on, which might mean they have to go and they in themselves have to go and sell rights to the film to other people. So it's a kind of, I suppose it's a kind of a gamble, you know. I just felt that my priority with the film was for only a beautiful film to be made of each of these books, in that I'd had such a good experience publishing the books. I didn't want them to be, you know, soiled by turning into a bad film, as so often happens, let's be honest. We've all seen films like that, and you're thinking, how could anyone have said yes to this?
Or you've read the book and then you read or watch the movie and you're like, no. Yes, how about you in the glasses in the fourth row?
Hi, Emma. My name's Naomi. I was just going to ask you, what was the experience of writing the adaptation of The Wonder versus Room? Because Room was your first go, right? So was this a bit easier, or were more challenges presented?
So the question is with the difference between writing the adaptation for Room as opposed to writing the adaptation for The Wonder.
The Wonder did feel a bit easier in that with Room, it was a brand new form to me. I literally had to get a stack of books on screenwriting from the Weldon Library and sit there trying to work out, you know, there's a lot of jargon involved. And there are things that seem like rules that I probably took way too seriously about, like, oh, must have a climax there, must have a twist there. And then when I was actually working with Lenny Abrahamson, he never referred to, you know, third act climaxes or anything. He was never counting pages or saying where the twist should come in. And so he told me to relax about a lot of that. So with The Wonder, I was probably less hung up on the kind of so-called rules of screenwriting, but also just more used to keeping that narrative thread taut, I suppose. I'd had more experience, not just with Room, but with all these other projects that haven't been made yet. So I'd had more experience screenwriting. But it could also be that why it felt easier to me was just that I was more relaxed about it, because I knew that you don't get to pick all the words, you don't get to make all the decisions, you know. With Room, I think with my very first draft, I felt like each scene had to be absolutely ready to blossom on film. Yeah. Whereas with any one draft of The Wonder, I knew a lot of things are going to change, a lot of things are going to happen before this is filmed, and then at the editorial stage, it's as if really you're writing it all over again. You know, so I don't mean that I was sloppy about it, but I just knew that a lot of people will have input into this. A lot of this will be rearranged, moved around. So I just was more relaxed about the fact that you can't control every little detail, and that any screenplay is really just a blueprint rather than being a finished work in itself. Yeah.
Did you write The Wonder thinking this might be a movie? Because you knew. No,
I would never write any novel thinking it would be a movie, because that would be a kind of perversely indirect way to write a movie. And I hate if you're reading a novel and they say things like, he looked just like Tom Hanks. Right. And you're like, okay, you're fishing for Tom Hanks there, aren't you? No, I make something a novel if I think a novel is the very best way to fully explore that story, you know, give the maximum detail, the maximum analysis, be in the nurse's head for 2 weeks with no breaks. And then after that, I sometimes say to myself, you know, it could also work beautifully as a film, and there would be other advantages. I'd say the landscape probably looms larger in the film because you literally can see it. While I didn't write it in order for it to be a film, you know, probably the thought occurred to me, but I would kind of postpone that thought.
Right.
Yeah.
Put it away. I saw other hands up. Yes, from the second row.
I'm a filmmaker of more years than I think I remember. And I've had the fortune and misfortune of seeing good and bad production design. For two projects that you've committed to film, what's your opinion on the production design? Has it matched the movie that's been in your head? Please tell me what your opinions on that is.
So the question is about production design and how much what was in your head actually translated into the films.
It's funny, people quite often ask me, like, do I go on set and walk around going like, oh no, that table's wrong. The very idea that I would try and, tell the specialists their job. I remember a breakthrough moment for me when I stepped onto the room set, which, by the way, was bigger than in the book, because in the book, I made it like that you could just possibly exist in this 10-foot by 10-foot space, but to get the cameras in, they had to make it a little bit bigger. They're not much bigger. And again, the theatre version, which will be at the Grand here in January, that too is even bigger, just literally so that the audience can see inside. But anyway, when I stepped onto the set, I was looking around, and I bent down, I looked at the little electrical outlet, and they had drawn on a little face. And I just, at that moment, realized I could trust these people. They hadn't just done what it said in the script. They hadn't just done what it said in the book. They had thought through every little detail from the point of view of the people living there. They did things like they had an algorithm to work out how faded each bit of the wall would be based on the prevailing sunlight.
Wow.
There's a level of obsessive commitment to realism in film that's just staggering. And not just realism, but I remember talking to the costume designer in room, and she had this arc for each character, even though the clothes aren't anything you'd really notice. And I would say production design I noticed even more in The Wonder, because it's bringing to life this mid-19th century Irish world. So they gave me this tour of the prop warehouse, for instance, and they would have multiples of everything. They would have, 10 different coal scuttles. And they had lots of pewter, lots of glass. They had gone to folk museums, and said, like, who does your straw braiding? And they would track down 2 elderly women who braid things in straw, and they'd get them to braid, Catholic decorations to have on the walls. Just an astonishing level of perfectionism. They showed me this amazing sofa they'd made, and they said, oh, we didn't end up using this one. So just, this is the kind of thing the Netflix money was spent on, was obsessive getting it right. One object they gave me as my souvenir, they had 3 of these things. They're like a ship in a bottle, but a crucifixion scene. This is apparently a 19th century Irish bit of kitsch. They used to do little crucifixion scenes in bottles and then immerse them in coloured water, and it's called a god in a bottle. So they made 3 of these things for the film. I don't know, will you see one, even in the background? And you may not, but they made them anyway. Wow. So that's the level of perfectionism.
And now it's in your Wortley Village house.
Yes, indeed.
Awesome.
I have my God in a bottle. Yeah.
Your God in a bottle. Are there any other questions from the audience? Sorry, did someone pointed? Sorry. In the right there. Sorry, stayed right. I didn't see you. Yep. So the question is about writer's block. What do you do when you're sitting there and you have no idea what the heck comes next?
Well, it's interesting. The example you gave, if I heard right, was I don't know what to write next. I would say that's not exactly writer's block. That's, in a way, plot planning. And I do a huge amount of planning in advance, so that I ask myself these questions, like what happens next? But I'm usually asking it well before the actual drafting. I'm not one of these writers who can somehow just fish a great plot out of the back of their subconscious. I have to do a huge amount of kind of conscious shaping of the story in advance, because otherwise I could be very far down a path before realizing that in fact, I'm lost in the woods. So I recommend planning. It makes it all a lot less scary, and you can see your big problems early on. You can realize, for instance, the reason my plot is getting stuck is that I'm following the wrong person through this story. It should be a different point of view, or maybe it should all be told from 15 years later, or maybe it should all be told, by a robot. So big questions like point of view and when and where you stop and start the story, and from what vantage point you see it. I think those questions are often best tackled at the very start, rather than just expecting the plot to miraculously happen as you're drafting. But then I would say writer's block is where you just don't feel like writing at all, or just can't think of any writing to do. And I think how I avoid that is by the distraction of having a lot of different projects. So at the moment, for instance, I'm working on a musical with one collaborator. I've got another film project, and I've got 2 books of fiction. And so I would sort of work on whichever of those appeals to me for a couple of weeks at a time. But if I start to feel not so much blocked as I get a bit nauseated by the repetition of any one of them. Sometimes I'm like, oh God, I've been immersed in the details of this for ages. I work on the next one. So, you know, it's a kind of a distraction technique, I suppose, but it means that I would say I never get absolute writer's block. I just get a kind of restlessness about any one project. And when all else fails, I go to the library and research something that I won't be writing for another 5 years. So it's way down the line, and so it's full of novelty and excitement, you know. And, you know, days when I don't have a single original thought myself, I can at least do the research, you know.
Or just watch Netflix.
It's all research.
That's right.
Actually, during COVID, I started watching TV in the daytime, which
Yeah.
before COVID would have completely shocked me. But,
Right.
you know, it doesn't mean I don't get my work done. And, you know, and I think it was Schitt's Creek got me started. I thought, this is improving my happiness
Yeah.
and probably helping my writing. You know?
There was one more question. Okay, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to the research that you're doing? So when you're plotting a book, how does the research get incorporated?
There's how does the research that you do for your works, how does it get incorporated in the final product?
I do a huge amount of research, and it's fairly formless in that it doesn't proceed according to a sort of a set plan. It's more that I read and try and find out a lot about anything that seems to be coming up. And you have to be willing to not so much throw away, but just not use much of that research. You have to just always be looking out for the most helpful little vivid details. And I suppose one way that the you know, planning and the research work together is that in my sort of planning, okay, I'll give you an example from my most recent novel. So it's set in a hospital in Ireland in 1918, and I was writing it very much from the point of view of this one nurse midwife who was running this tiny ward. And I thought of her as running this ward alone, just 3 patients, and I needed to know how she would do the various tasks. So I thought, okay, how do you make a bed if it's 1918? What are the protocols? So I found books of advice for nurses written by very sort of stern doctors from about 1910. And I'm looking at the diagrams of how you change a bed, and I'm thinking, she can't do this alone, because there's an awful lot of, you know, roll the patient to here, and then put the clean sheet there, and then roll them back, and I'm thinking, she needs a second pair of hands. So in that case, the detail of the research produced the big question of, I need another character, I need a volunteer helper. And then to kind of flesh out who that volunteer helper might have been, I found myself looking at this amazing source of information, which is, like in Canada, in Ireland, we're doing a huge amount of investigating our terrible past, basically, and our history of locking people up in residential institutions. In Ireland, we did it to our own poor, basically, rather than to any one group. So it wasn't specifically genocidal, but it was, in a very similar way, kind of, you know, scraping the unwanted off the streets and locking them away for life. We had things like so-called Magdalene laundries where fallen women would do really, you know, unpaid labor for their whole lives. So anyway, I decided that I would read the Irish government's huge report on these orphanages and residential homes as my background for this volunteer. So you can see how we're going like research into a plot point, and then the plot point leads you to more research, and you know, it's an endless kind of to and fro between the very detailed stuff and then the more bird's eye questions of who are my main characters. And it's never ended, because at every point in the editing, I find myself saying, there's something else I know nothing about, and I go down another rabbit hole.
That's so interesting. You learn so much about so many things that you never knew that you needed to know. That is all the time that we have for today. So thank you, Emma. And thank you to the audience. Welcome to one of the first in-person events that many of you probably have attended. Thank you, Emma, so much.
That was
We
great fun.
cannot
Thank
wait
you.
to see the wonder.
Thank you. I so enjoyed all the film-focused questions, because, you know, most of my life is spent focused on my fiction, so it's great
Yeah.
fun to be in a sort of like film context.
Yeah, that you know, it's the same for me. I always ask questions about books, but this is fun that I got to think of questions that have to do with film. If just a bit of housekeeping, if you can exit through the doors over there on the left, so not the ones where you came in, but on, well, my left, stage left. So let's give a round of applause for Emma Donoghue.
Thank you.